Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Huron Peak in central Colorado, and today we're going to talk about Romania. Romania is one of those middle powers that kind of has been dealt a bad hand. It's got a good chunk of land in the lower Danube, and it's bracketed by the Carpathian Mountains, but it's not quite big enough to kind of stand up to the neighbors. So it's got these three access points, really. You've got the Vienna Gap to the northwest that allows access to the northern European plain. You've got the Bessarabian Gap to the northeast, which allows access to what I call the Eurasian Hordelands. And then down south, you've got the Balkan Mountains that pinch off access to the Sea of Marmara region. Now, the northern European plain, the Hordelands, and Marmara are all capable of supporting absolutely massive powers that have dominated history as long as it's been recorded. And Romania is kind of stuck in the middle. It has access to all three of them, but could never generate the sort of military force that is necessary to punch out beyond those gaps and do anything meaningful. In fact, because it's proximate to all of these gaps, it is usually one of the first countries that gets conquered or amalgamated when one of those three mega regions decides that it wants to expand beyond their natural borders. And in that sort of environment, Romania faces a double bind. Number one, whether it's coming from the Northern European plain or Marmara or the Eurasian Hordelands, it's got to decide whether it's going to fight or whether it's going to accede. And if it chooses to accede, then it is not in charge of its own destiny anymore, and it usually ends up being a cog in somebody else's empire. The second problem is that Romania, while being the most populous of the countries in this squeeze zone in between, is certainly not the only one. And there are others that might be a little bit more defensible and have a little bit richer geography. And Romania is in constant competition with all of them. So even if it can make its peace with its larger neighbors, it then has to make peace with its smaller neighbors. Some, like Bulgaria, it usually gets along with pretty well. Others, like Serbia, are tetchy. But probably the biggest problem of all of them is Hungary. Two problems here. Number one, Hungary has a little bit more defensive of a geography than Romania, so it has a little bit longer history in terms of being an independent power, especially since it is up against that Northern European plain gap. Bessarabia is a 50-mile gap, and it's really hard for a country the size of Romania to plug that. But the Vienna Gap is only a couple miles wide, and most of that is the Danube River, making it fairly easy for even a small country like Hungary to hold the line. That means that Hungary and Romania are the two countries that tend to find themselves fighting more often than even the major powers that are in the lands beyond. And if you want to go just back to the Cold War, there were these delightful stories that came out at the end about how, yes, we were in a Cold War of the West versus the Soviet Empire, but within the Soviet Empire, the Hungarian and the Romanian intelligence services were duking it out behind the scenes while they were technically on the same side. Now, looking forward, the Romanians have some decisions to make. They know that the European system is of limited duration. They know that it's in demographic decline, and they know that there's going to be a fight for the region once again, just like there has in every age of their history that has been recorded to this point. Until very recently, they were convinced that when the Russians came again, they'd have to cut a deal, that they wouldn't have a choice. But the Russians are doing so poorly. In Ukraine, the Romanians are starting to entertain the possibility that there might not even be a major power on the other side of the Bessarabian Gap again. And that means that the other regional power that they would probably have to cut a deal with, Turkey, becomes a lot more digestible. Turkey's an up-and-coming power. The relations with the Romanians going back centuries have been pretty good. They've been excellent since the Cold War, maybe a little cool, but certainly professional. And if the Romanians are entering a world where the Russians are no longer a strategic factor, but Turkey is, then that's a partnership. That's not vassaldom. And that could potentially spell the greatest chapter in Romanian history to date. There are plenty of caveats in that statement. Romania has among the world's worst demographies. They are one of the top 10 countries in the world for using abortion as a birth control method, and they're among the worst demographic structures in Europe. They're going to have to find a new economic model, and they're going to have to figure out what happens post-EU and maybe even post-NATO. These are all big questions, but the fact that they've got a rising partner in Turkey right next door, but not directly adjacent, Bulgaria's in the way, that's a pretty good setup. All right, that's it. Take care.
civil stability doesn't matter until the day that it does. The only way that a Russian government changes course is when it collapses. I don't see us being there yet. Doesn't mean we won't reach that point. And Putin has gutted the Russian elite over the last 25 years. There are probably only about 110, 120 people left with any sort of authority. And most of them are over 55. So we are looking at the final age of the Russian government, but that doesn't mean it's going to collapse on Friday.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we're catching up with the geopolitical analyst Peter Zeihan. Peter is a best-selling author whose most recent book is The End of the World is Just the Beginning, Mapping the Collapse of Globalization. Peter, good to speak to you. Last time we met, it was for our special marking the anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let's start then with this Tucker Carlson interview, the interview with President Putin. How I know I don't really want to give him much publicity, but how much has it been noticed or talked about in the US?
You're having the normal people who have decided that despite Tucker being fired from every job he's ever been, and despite his legal defense here in the United States being that he's not a journalist, so he doesn't have to say anything that's accurate. In fact, his legal defense is I am allowed to lie, I'm encouraged to lie on television because I'm a propagandist. The people who think he's still great are talking about him, and everyone else has basically ignored it. And that's really the end of the story here.
Yeah, and the former head of MI6, Britain's Secret Intelligence Service here in the UK, Sir Alex Younger, he was on the radio just in the aftermath of this and said it was unforgivably boring. Did it actually achieve anything?
It achieves some clarity. We've always known that on this side of the pond that Tucker Carlson has been a Russian shill for a few years. But between not just his interview, but what he has done since the interview, he is now going out and doing Soviet-style propaganda pieces in Russia, talking about how glorious Russian life is in Moscow under sanctions. And this is the sort of things that you would have seen in the Soviet Union in the 1950s or the 1970s. And for him to have fallen so far so fast, I mean, it's a little embarrassing for him. But it gives you an idea that the Russians really are having some issues working some of their assets in the West. I'm not suggesting that the propaganda effort has not made gains, but they really have to go to kind of a lower tier of viewer if they're going to get any traction.
Let's talk about Donald Trump now for a moment, making shockwaves with his comments about NATO, effectively encouraging President Putin to attack alliance members who failed to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. Has that been reported much in the US?
Oh, yes, that is loud.
And what has the reaction been exactly?
A kind of horror from the point of view of folks in the center, which I think is not entirely honest, if we're going to speak candidly here. One of the problems that people in the rest of the world, especially in Europe, have kind of forgotten is that the amount of time that most NATO countries had just kind of treated the alliance as a side piece really did erode confidence in the Americans and what the Europeans would do when the rubber would hit the road. And while I am certainly a strong supporter of the alliance, especially now because of the Ukraine war, and I've definitely seen a lot of the allies step up, unless there's a significant increase in European commitment and willing to get blood in the game, what Trump said may have been a little vainglorious, but that is the future. For NATO to function, it needs to be more than an American alliance. And in my first book, The Accidental Superpower, I talk about how the Americans are losing confidence in the alliance because of this issue. Now, if it had been anyone but Trump who would have said it, it would have probably triggered a lot more soul searching because Trump goes for things for the public pizzazz. But the issue is a very, very real one. And treating this as just a Trump issue, I think, isn't going to do anyone any good.
But if he does, in fact, become the next US president, what effect do you think what influence do you think he will have over the future of NATO? What do you think actions he might take?
Trump made it very clear, unofficially, in the last 6 months of his first term, that if he was reelected on his first day, he would pull the United States out of NATO. Now, I don't think Trump personally has much of a chance of winning the second round, and that assuming he's not in prison. But if he were to win, yes, NATO would lose the United States.
So let's talk about funding for Ukraine, because after weeks of setbacks, the US Senate has finally given its approval for the $60 billion aid package as part of an overall $95 billion wartime aid package. It still has to get through the House of Representatives, though. How much focus is President Biden in his administration paying to Ukraine at the moment, do you think?
The problem with the United States political system when it comes to foreign policy is we're really only able to function and focus on one issue at a time. There's really only three people in the American political system who have a role in terms of policy making for foreign policy. You've got the National Security Advisor, the President himself, and the Federal Reserve Chief. And they just can't deal with multiple crises. There's not enough bandwidth. So because we now have Iran and the Gaza war happening at the same time, and because the Chinese degradation has accelerated, the Ukraine war by default has taken a back seat. It's not that it's not a priority, it's just that it's not the priority anymore. And without authorization from Congress, there's only so much the administration can do in terms of assistance. Now, what we're probably going to see in the House is you'll get an effort for what's called a disclosure petition, which will force a vote even if the Speaker doesn't want to bring the bill to the floor. But that's going to take at least another month. And what that will mean is that the moderate Republicans who are already getting hammered by the hard right will basically be labeled as Republicans in name only again, because they will have to support this with centrist Democrats to get this through. I have no doubt that some version of that will happen, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen this month. We're probably not going to see new aid for Ukraine until April.
And what effect do you think that will have on Ukraine?
Well, anything that's going to get ammo in their artillery tubes is going to be what they need. What we've seen in battles like Avdiivka is that the Ukrainians have gone from almost artillery parity, which has allowed them to inflict 8-1 and to 10-1 casualty ratios on the Russians, to something much more closer to parity because they can't fire artillery at all. They've been relying on these little 2-pound drones that they've been mass producing, and that's great, but those drones only have a range of a couple of miles, sorry, Britain, about 3 kilometers, versus the artillery, which has a range closer to 40 kilometers.
Just to go back to that, so you are confident then that this aid package will actually be agreed then, but they'll have to wait till April, is that right?
Right. We have to basically do an end run around a faction in Congress. Sorry. This is kind of a treat for me as an American, because we've had to follow the ins and outs of your parliament's procedures for the last 7 years. Now you get to do it for us. Okay. So the way the American system works is if you want to get a majority in the House of Representatives, it's not a majority of the votes. It's a majority of the seats. And we have a number of vacancies. So for the Republicans to get something through, they need every single vote minus one. If they lose more than one of their members, they can't get anything through. So you've got this cluster of about a dozen people out of the 300 Republicans who are in the chamber who are willing to block everything, not Ukraine. They're not blocking Ukraine. They're blocking everything. And so this has now been the least productive Congress we have ever had in our country's history. And doing an end run around the American Republican manager of the House, the Speaker, is not something that is done lightly, because it usually means that the Speaker gets kicked out within a few weeks. And we are already on our 5th for this Congress. So deciding to pull that legislative trick means that we basically commit to the House of Representatives falling apart again. So they want to be very careful when they decide to go for this petition that this is the issue that they really want to die on.
And when you get moves by the UK's Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, making this direct appeal, as he did to Republicans in the US, to not show the weakness displayed against Hitler in the 1930s, and you have Grant Shapps saying the world's dictators are watching, does that actually have any traction in the US at all?
It does, not with the 12 people who are boycotting action, but it does with the mainline Republicans who realize what is at stake in Ukraine.
Okay, that's good to know. Ukraine's military intelligence has this week confirmed that it has sunk a Russian Navy landing ship close to the Russian-controlled Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. How important is it at this moment for Ukraine to demonstrate it can still take the fight to the Russians?
I don't think it's so much of a public relations issue. I think it's just an evolution of the weapons issue. One of the things that we've seen over the course of the last 18 months is the Ukrainian drone industry has really come into its own. It's holding the line at Avdiivka in a way that we didn't think was possible. And the ship that was sunk with a fundamentally new drone, which was basically a modified jet ski, something that was not in their arsenal 6 weeks ago. So the Ukrainians aren't just showing that they can hit at longer and longer ranges, but it's with more and more novel weapon systems. I think the weapon systems to watch for the most, the ones where we're going to be seeing the greatest impact on the Russians, aren't naval, though. They're these long-range air drones that are now striking chemical and energy facilities across the length and the breadth of the Russian coastline, which should be the part of the Russian system that has the best air defense. Western sanctions have had an impact on Russian energy exports, but not nearly as dramatic as what the Ukrainians have done by hitting a few fuel depots and fractionating columns.
And these parts of the campaign that you describe, it comes after a major shake-up of the Ukrainian armed forces, with the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, General Valery Zaluzhny, replaced by General Alexander Syrsky, and 4 new other appointments in the military. What is President Zelensky trying to achieve exactly?
This is something that is a little concerning, not because I think he's made a horrible mistake or anything, but anytime you see political instability in the midst of a war, you have to be a little concerned. The outgoing folks were fairly competent and fairly politically popular. The new ones are relatively untested. But I don't want to overstate this. Whenever you have a lot of changes in tactics and strategy, especially with the dynamism of the circumstances among the allies, you're going to want to have different people in different positions regularly. The question is, what does that do to the morale of the troops? And because we've had basically the same 2 divisions fighting the Russians nonstop for 14 months now, the morale of those people is everything. So we're going to know very, very quickly whether this is going to have a positive or negative impact or otherwise. In terms of the implications for democracy, I don't see any, because these are appointed military positions. These are not civilian administrators. I wouldn't be worried at all about Zelensky and democracy until and unless they decide to not have elections. And then that's a very different conversation.
You mentioned morale. This General Syrsky, he apparently, from what I understand, is not popular with the troops. His nickname is the Butcher because of his reputation for his lack of concern for their welfare. He is trying to change that because he's been sort of promoting a kind of image of being more caring as a military leader. It's extremely important given the pressing need to recruit more troops.
No, that's absolutely the concern. And the tactics that he has expressed in the past are wildly appropriate to the front of today, but that doesn't mean that they would be inappropriate to the front of tomorrow. So the question is whether he is capable of changing tactics and operational strategy based on circumstances. We will know very soon. And if the answer is no, then he will not be there very long.
He's just visited the front line in the east of the country with Ukraine's defense minister and described the situation as precarious. What challenges does he face?
Without the ammo that is necessary to hold back the Russians in multiple places, the Ukrainians have really had to ration what they have and focus on these drone assaults. The strength of the Ukrainian system militarily is that they've really devolved a lot of decision making to the local level, but the local level can only do so much if they have limited ammo. So if we don't see a change in the military supplies soon, that local authority will evolve very, very quickly into a mass rout. Because as soon as one group decides to pull out because they can't shoot back, there's no reason then to expect the others to stick around. That's the trick here. And I'm not sure that Syrsky has an answer for that. But I am not a tactical guy and I am not on the front. But that is why this is all precarious. Now, luckily, the Ukrainians have spent the last 6 months doing a bit of a shadow of what the Russians have done for the last 18 months and building up a series of minefields behind their positions to retard any sort of rapid advance. So I don't think we'd be looking at a collapse of the front, but we could see a lot more movement than we've seen in the last year.
And one of the challenges that General Sersky is facing is the reform of the Ukrainian army, and Zelensky wants a plan. What needs to be done, and how does its command and control structure stack up against what the Russians are doing, and how they've changed as we go into the third year?
That's a good example of where Zersky might actually be the right guy for the job. So he has his background a little bit more rooted in the Soviet system of top-down control, and to this point that would not have worked for the Ukrainians. That local control, the local decision-making, the local innovations is what has allowed the Ukrainians to do well in the face of just massive odds. And against them has been a top-down control from the Russian system, which has wildly underperformed. But we're not in the first year of the war anymore. And as we enter year 3, what we're discovering is the lack of top-down control in Ukraine has prevented the lessons from each individual unit from coming up to the top, being turned into a broader strategy, and then percolating down to everyone. On the opposite side, on the Russian side, every once in a while, a lesson does come up through the top against all odds and penetrates the generals' heads at the very, very top. And they're like, yeah, that actually works. Let's have everyone do that. It's slow, it's painful, it's inefficient, but it means incrementally the Russians are getting better. And when they get better, everyone gets better. So the balance between the two has started to flip. And the Ukrainians are going to have to figure out how to translate local successes into a broader strategic approach. And that is the new guy's primary job. If he can pull that off, you combine Russian top-down coordination with local innovation, then we're in a different game.
And you know, people watching the war quite closely have been saying that the actions and how much he commits to defending Avdiivka will be very key, because he is the man who at all costs defended Bakhmut, and we know what happened there. And what do you think line he will take on Avdiivka, and how important is that as symbolic of the way he's going to operate as a military leader?
That's a great comparison, and I'm not sure it really paints him in the best, well, it doesn't paint him in the best light, but I'm not sure it's entirely fair. So in the defense of Bakhmut, keep in mind that the casualty ratios from the Russians to the Ukrainians was 7-1. So we can easily say that, you know, he should have ordered a pullout earlier and to try to avoid some Ukrainian casualties. But we are at the moment in a war of attrition. And as long as we're in a war of attrition, those are exactly the sorts of numbers that the Ukrainians need. Anything less than that, honestly, is a loss for them, because the demographic overhang of the Russians versus the Ukrainians is so huge. So far in Avdiivka, we're probably looking at an even higher number, probably 8-1 to 10-1. That's exactly the position we need to be. As long as the Ukrainians are trapped in a battle of attrition, this is what has to happen. The ideal is that the Ukrainians will be able to turn this into a battle of movement. But in order to do that, they have to be able to break through the lines in the first place. And at the moment, they do not have the gear to do that.
In a recent interview, the Russian ambassador to London, Andrei Kelin, said that Russia cannot be beaten, bragging its resources are enormous. I know he would say this, but it has lost more than 3,000 tanks, according to a London-based think tank, since the start of the full-scale invasion. Is there no price too high for Russia?
No, there is not. From the Russian point of view, unless they can achieve something similar to their old Soviet perimeter, their country's indefensible. And they're right. The Russian Federation on its own has 8,000 kilometers of exposed borders. But if they can advance through Ukraine into Romania, Poland, and the Balts, that shrinks from 8,000 down to about 800. And with their less competent military, that is something that they can plug. They're not necessarily fighting this war for this war. They're fighting this war in order to achieve a securable perimeter for when their demographics fall apart over the course of the next 20 years. It's not a stupid plan. And that means that the Russians will not stop until they reach there, or they're forced to stop. In terms of the hardware they have, yes, they've lost 3,000 tanks. That's probably the sum total of their entire pre-war operational inventory. But they have at least another 9,000 that they can refurbish in addition to anything they can bring online. So they can maintain this pace for at least another 8 to 10 years. And then there's also the manpower issue. Yes, they've lost dead and wounded probably close to 500,000 so far, but they have another 7 to 8 million men in their 20s that haven't fled yet. So again, 8 to 10 years is how long they can keep this up, and they will keep it up until they can't.
Yeah, I mean, the Russian public is paying a high price for this war.
Yes.
We have an election coming up in Russia. We know what the conclusion will be, but how important is it that in that election, President Putin is at least seen to be winning comfortably and have the support of it? Because the ordinary person, you know, the electricity is going off. They're having all kinds of problems outside the big cities. So it could be a precarious time, could it not, for President Putin?
To be perfectly blunt, you Brits have been duking it out with the Russians a lot longer than us Americans. You know how high their tolerance for pain is. Civil stability doesn't matter until the day that it does. The only way that a Russian government changes course is when it collapses. I don't see us being there yet. Doesn't mean we won't reach that point. And Putin has gutted the Russian elite over the last 25 years. There are probably only about 110, 120 people left with any sort of authority. And most of them are over 55. So we are looking at the final age of the Russian government, but that doesn't mean it's going to collapse on Friday.
You previously in this interview, you said that the US lacks the bandwidth or words to that effect to deal with more than one foreign policy crisis at a time. What do you think the consequences might be of that for Europe at this time?
Well, the French keep saying that they want European sovereignty when it comes to defense issues. There's an opportunity here, but there's really not a lot that the Europeans can do in the short term, short being in the next several weeks, in order to change the American conversation here. What is required is a deep commitment to defense in the light of the idea that the Russians are coming for Warsaw and nukes are part of the conversation now. It's not just on the fringes. Now we're seeing movement out of Germany. Just in the last week, they've announced that they're basically increasing their defense spending by almost a third, and at a single leap have managed to get back up over that 2% threshold that they've been avoiding for so long. That's a great step. Can you You're a Brit. Of course, you can imagine what the German procurement system looks like when they decide to do that. That needs to happen in another dozen countries in Western Europe, not in Central Europe. The Central Europeans have already done that. The only way you're going to change the conversation of the United States is make it numerically obvious that the situation has changed. Now, we have seen that to a degree with European funding for Ukraine. The Europeans have massively stepped up in the last year and are now providing significantly more aid than the Americans, even before the Americans had this congressional problem. But in terms of policy, the coordinating function of Europe in NATO versus the United States and NATO just broadly doesn't exist. And that's got to change.
And in terms, you mentioned Germany, might it actually not be such a bad thing that the US forces Europe to get more serious about its own defense right now? And also referring back to the kind of things that the potential President Trump had said. This week, the boss of Germany's Rheinmetall, its biggest defense firm, told the BBC that ammunition stocks are currently empty and that Europe will need 10 years before it can be fully ready to defend itself, which is quite a frightening comment to make.
Well, from an American point of view who views himself as a bit of a historian, I see both. I both don't take this very seriously, and I'm very scared of where it might lead. The Germans have proven in times past, when they feel the need, that they can turn around their entire military complex, a military industrial complex, in a matter of months. And if the funding is now there, then it's just an issue of building the industrial plant, and that is something the Germans do better than anyone else in the world, including the Chinese. So, if the decision has been made, Germany is back in the game as a major military industrial player. In the case of the Ukraine war, that would obviously have been an unalloyed positive. But as an American who knows his history, the idea of Germany being in the game as a military player in the center of Europe does make me a little nervous. So for this to work in a way that it doesn't generate the next problem, it has to not just be Germany.
Um, Denmark is the most recent country to raise concerns over NATO going to war with Russia in the near future, and several other countries have done the same, as has the chair of NATO's military committee. How realistic do you think that prospect is?
It's a very realistic fear. The Europeans have been deliberately downplaying the threat of a direct confrontation with the Russians ever since the war began, because they didn't really know how the war was going to go. Now that the Ukrainians are on the back foot to a degree, and there's a real concern that we could see a break in the favor of the Russians, there was always a recognition in NATO capitals that if Ukraine falls, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Poland, and Romania are next. That is the only way that the Russians get to the position where they feel they need to be. And so now that Ukraine is looking weaker, preparing the population for what is the next logical step in this conflict is smart. I just hope it's sufficiently jarring to get everyone to step up militarily in terms of training, recruitment, and procurement.
What are the main developments that you're looking for in 2024? What are you going to be looking out for?
Number one, it's a question of the military complex in Europe. If the Europeans can build out the capacity to get 1 million artillery shells to the Ukrainians every 2 or 3 months, that is what's necessary. So we're talking about building out the capacity of building that stuff by a factor of 5 minimum. On the United States side, we have a much harder decision to make. We, like Europe, are running out of the older equipment that we've been handing over to the Ukrainians so far. Probably 70 to 80% of our aid to Ukraine to this point has been outdated equipment that we never used. And so from a budgetary point of view, it's been a non-issue. We're running out of that, which means that we have to make a choice. Number one, we either build up our military industrial complex to build outdated equipment to continue to supply the Ukrainians, or we delve into our top line stuff. And if we do that, the logistical and the support tail that is required to train the Ukrainians, much less support the Ukrainians, has to expand massively. We're only now starting to have that conversation. We will probably have an answer before we get to the presidential election, which will of course be shaped by politics. But the equipment that the Ukrainians have been fighting with to this point, there's no more of it to be had. And figuring out how we get to the next stage is going to be very, very, very difficult.
Peter Zeihan, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from a very foggy Colorado. It is the 16th of February, and the news today is that Russian prison authorities have announced the death of Alexei Navalny, who was a political prisoner who had the audacity to criticize Vladimir Putin and run for office long ago, years ago, and has been in prison ever since. He was transferred about a year ago to a high-security prison in the middle of nowhere in Siberia. It was an old Soviet gulag. This is basically where the Russian government sends people when they want them to die because it's cold, it's brutal, there's no heat, and medical service is deliberately denied. So the idea that he's dead is not exactly a shock. The Russian government very well could have actually executed him, and no one would know. Now, back in 2021, the Biden administration said the death of Navalny would trigger a collapse in international relations that would really punish the Russians. But since then, the Russians have launched a war and killed a couple 100,000 people in Ukraine. So pretty much all of the stops that could be pulled out have been pulled out. And about the only way to punish the Russians now would be to send a lot more weapons to Ukraine, or to do an outright block of all of their energy exports, neither of which on the moment, for a mix of political and economic reasons, are on deck. So I don't want to say anything weird like, the Russians are going to get away with this, because there's a lot going on, but don't expect any sort of tactical response from the Americans in general, or the West. Now, before anyone gets to crying about this, a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, Russia's not a democracy. It hasn't really been a democracy in over 20 years. So even if Navalny was allowed to continue to be part of the political conversation in Russia, it's not like he has any chance of changing policy. He was more of a personal annoyance to Putin and nothing more. There are other people within the ruling party who have decided to run for presidency against Putin on a very nationalist ticket, but just be opposed to the war, and they're not being allowed to participate either. So it really doesn't matter. It's something that pro-democracy activists in the West get really excited about because he's a name that more people know, but he was never going to have any influence. Second, careful what you wish for. Navalny may have been a nicer guy than Putin because, low bar, but he was just as nationalist. And his biggest criticism of the Ukraine war wasn't that it was happening, but it just wasn't being prosecuted very well. People forget that the strong predilection among Russians is to continue the war. They just don't want to be part of it personally. The idea that Russia needs to expand its borders in order to survive is not one that is particularly debated in Russia. It's generally been their security policy for 400 years, that as long as your external borders are flat and open, you're not safe. So you have to go through Ukraine to get to Romania and Poland and the rest. Now, of course, that's bad for Romania and Poland and the rest, but the Russians are not misreading the map. And unfortunately, that gets wrapped up in the political discussion so that folks like Navalny appear more important than they really are. So, I feel bad for the guy and his family, but we were probably always going to get here. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan coming to you from Colorado, where we're about to get another 6 inches of snow. A lot of you have written in about the Biden administration's decision to put an operational pause pending further review on liquefied natural gas exports. There are a lot of people talking a lot of things on all sides. On the energy industry side, they're saying that this is a breach of proper protocol, and it's going to really inhibit future investments across the sector. And on the environmentalist side, they're talking about how this is the end of that sector altogether, and they're dancing and singing Kumbaya. Everybody's wrong. Let me kind of lay out what this stuff is. So natural gas is normally transported by pipe because it's difficult to move, it's difficult to store, it's difficult to produce. And so you'll have a pipe network like in North America that is separate from the pipe network in Europe, which is separate from the pipe network in China. Those are the three big ones. You got some smaller ones around the world. They don't connect, or they can't connect. And so if you want to link these together, what you need to do is have a facility on a coast that will chill the stuff down to something like negative 300 degrees or so. And then it's a liquid, and then you put it into a specially designed tanker that can handle these cryogenic fluids. And then you transport it across the ocean to another facility where it unloads and is regasified and then put into the new system. Now, we've been doing this for a few decades, but it's only in the last 15 years that it's really started to become big. And the primary reason for that is the environmental movement, because natural gas, if it's properly burned in an appropriate facility, a combined cycle natural gas plant, generates about half of the CO2 emissions of, say, a coal plant. Also, you can spin up a natural gas facility in just a few minutes, as opposed to a coal facility, which can take hours to even days. And so if you want to pair it with, say, wind and solar, it's the perfect complement fuel, because when the sun goes down or when the wind stops, you can just turn this thing on. And so if you want to get the full capacity from your wind and your solars, you really have to have a conventional system that's dispatchable like natural gas. Now, the United States currently has enough capacity, nameplate capacity, to chill and ship about 13 billion cubic feet of this stuff per day, which makes it the largest exporter in the world already. And under construction are facilities that would allow another 12 BCF per day, which, if you remove the United States' existing capacity from that, that's again the world's largest. And then there's already been stuff permitted for another 16 billion cubic feet per day. So, you add those three together and, where we are right now, that's enough to supply all of Japan. If we bring all of these online, that's almost enough to supply all of Europe. And the Biden freeze doesn't touch any of that. It is a pause of the review process for new facilities. Now, if the United States were to bring these all online, so 13 today, 12 in a few years, and down the road, maybe another 16. You're talking, 40? Yeah, it's more than 40 BCF. And that would be roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of total U.S. consumption of natural gas. If we did get the number that high, we'd have a lot more price linkage between the U.S. market and everywhere else. Remember, natural gas is pretty much sequestered, and LNG has traditionally just kind of played at the margins. But if we had this kind of volume, then Americans would start to be exposed to global natural gas prices. If that were to happen, instead of this $2 to $5 range that we've kind of become used to and is probably going to be our norm for the next few decades, we'd probably see prices regularly going above 15 or 20 as we have international price shocks because of things like, I don't know, the Ukraine war, or I don't know, something blowing up in the Middle East. When you only have about 10% exposure, or in our cases a little bit, 10%? Yeah, we got about 10% exposure. The price swings are very muted. And so back in 2021, when the Ukraine war was hot and heavy and we thought we were going to lose all the Russian gas at the same time, the Europeans were dealing with natural gas prices that were well over 70 for a few months, and it was pretty ugly for their industrial stuff. Anyway, let's talk about what people are talking about with this. On the industry side, the idea that we're going to build out past 40 is kind of a stretch anyway, so the oil companies are just whinging because someone's telling them that they can't do anything right now. Second, the Biden administration has not oversold this. They're saying it's a temporary pause of the review process to consider climate change. Well, if you want to consider climate change, natural gas is the perfect fuel to ship out in bulk because it's the only thing that really pairs with solar or wind. You're not going to do this with coal. That would be silly. And batteries sound great until you realize the industrial process that's required to build them at scale is never going to make them more than a niche use in specific areas. I'm not saying there's no use for them there, but natural gas is so much easier. It's so much cheaper. And by most measures, it's actually a lot cleaner too. So you're only going to put batteries in places like Phoenix maybe, where the solar intensity can be really, really high, and they just need to save some, for nights. And then on the environmental side, the celebrations, number one, this is not forever. It's a temporary pause of the review process, which the Biden administration can reverse with a stroke of a pen, or any additional leader could, for reasons environmental, economic, or strategic. Remember that a lot of the stuff that's getting shipped out right now is going to Europe in order to allow the Europeans an option other than sucking down Russian gas. So, this is kind of important from that front too. So everyone's kind of making a really big deal out of it, but I think the thing that is most hilarious is that the Biden administration has found a way, again, to satisfy the environmental activists without actually changing the system. This is very similar to what he did when he came into the presidency and he put a moratorium on fracking on federal lands, and everyone was all wailing and gnashing their teeth on one side and screaming bloody delight on the other side. Well, people forget that 99% of all shale operations are on private land, and that is regulated by the state. So it was less than 1% of wells that were affected at all. But it made the environmentalists happy, and it pissed off the energy industry, but it didn't really change anything at all. And Biden is never going to be the preferred candidate of the energy industry, and he was able to placate some of his more hardcore supporters. He's now done that again. So it's a fairly savvy political move that actually moves the needle not at all, which, is one of the smarter things you can say about politics these days. Hey everybody, winter is here. I'm coming to you from Eastern Washington, and today we're going to talk about winter in Texas. Now, if you guys remember back a couple of years, I think it was 2021, Texas got hit by a cold storm and basically everything collapsed. All of their energy generation, especially natural gas, just ceased functioning. And 200 people died over the course of a couple of weeks because of the lost electricity. That has not repeated with this cold front, even though by many measures in most parts of the state, temperatures got a little bit lower. So 5 things are different now compared to what happened back in 2021. First of all, while it did get as cold or even a little colder, the cold snap wasn't quite as long. It didn't last like the 2.5 weeks like it did last time. So the system wasn't put under as much long-term stress. But the bigger issues have to do with organizational and structural changes that the Texans have implemented. The big driving factor for things on the legal side and the regulatory side was Governor Abbott, who had spent a lot of time before 2021 making fun of California for their rolling brown and blackouts because they just have a horrible grid and a horrible energy system. And then, of course, In Texas, you had 200 people die, so he was personally motivated to make some changes. And he pushed them through the legislature, which forced the regulatory structures in Texas to adjust. And the biggest part of those changes affected the natural gas industry. So Texas, before 2021, didn't have its natural gas system winterized at all. And there's a lot of water vapor that comes up as a byproduct of natural gas production, and a lot of time it's in the gathering pipes. So what would happen when we got to sub-freezing temperatures is that water vapor would condense into liquid and eventually condense into ice and then clog the pipes. So the entire system across especially northern Texas and the Dallas area froze up, and so there was no fuel to burn to do everything else. For political reasons, Abbott blamed the wind industry because, the wind did stop going, but it was mostly natural gas that carries the backbone of power generation in Texas, and that is what failed most spectacularly. So in order to get things going, they actually had to waive almost all of their safety regimens and regulations, and people were going out with acetylene torches to manually melt the pipes. And of course, natural gas is flammable and explosive, so we were kind of lucky that didn't get completely out of hand. Anyway, this time around, the changes in regulations forced producers across Texas to actually implement some of the best winterizing technologies that we had back in the 1960s. And the Texas grid now is on par with where Arkansas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico were about 1975. So, this is some really basic stuff when it comes to things like insulation. Anyway, it was more than enough to make a difference. Okay, so that was the first big structural change. The other big structural changes had nothing to do with regulation. It's just how things have evolved. So the new turbines, wind turbines that the Texans had put up are more than 200 feet taller than the ones that were up 3 years ago. And that means they reach higher, they tap stronger air currents that are more reliable. So even though the wind did drop, we didn't see nearly the drop off in power generation capacity because the physical structure is now different. Second, Texas has put up a whole lot of solar. And when these winter storms come through Texas, usually what you get is a lot of wind, a lot of freezing rain, maybe some snow. And then once they blow through, it's cold, but it's clear. And so when you have temperatures in the 20s, solar doesn't really care what the temperature is unless it's like crazy low or crazy high. So solar was generating near record energy for the time of year. So you had two different streams of energy coming into the electrical system that they didn't really have last time, and their baseload system with natural gas worked a lot better than it did. This sort of change is the sort of thing we're going to see in some way across not just Texas, but the entire country and the eventual world. We're seeing more and more wind and more and more solar, and it doesn't always go right the first time. And we discover that meshing these systems together is more problematic than kind of the breezy things that the Greens say. But when you have multiple systems that do feed into the same network, you do get a lot of redundancy when one works and the other doesn't. The trick is to make sure you have enough spare capacity that you can dispatch at any given time. Now, in the past, solar and wind aren't very good at that because you can't dispatch them. If the sun's not out, if the wind's not blowing, they're kind of useless, and you have to rely on older fossil fuel things like natural gas. But what we're seeing in Texas specifically is that we're already seeing turbines that are 800 meters tall. And in the next year or two, we're going to be pushing the kilometer tall barrier. And again, stronger currents, more reliable, used for baseload. So I don't mean to suggest that all of these problems when it comes to storms and interruptions are going to go away. But as the technology evolves, we're getting better able to adapt and having a little bit more insulation on the backside as well. That's it from me. Everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Doubtful Sound, and in this next in our series of regional geopolitics in a post-American world, I want to talk about Northern Europe, specifically the Scandinavian region. Now, this is an area that has been fractured by history. You've got islands, you've got peninsulas, you've got de facto city-states, but while they have been powerful in the past, they've kind of been sleeping for the last 300 years. And during the Cold War and the post-Cold War era, it's been fractured into a number of different governments. But I think the best way to think about this is not so much a collection of countries, but a family of Vikings who are getting to know each other again. The original Vikings were the Danes and the Swedes, who basically went off, raided and pillaged, and founded little trading depots everywhere that they went, and some of those depots eventually rose to become significant countries in themselves. Think of Riga in Latvia, or Oslo in Norway, or Reykjavik in Iceland. But by the time we get to the modern era, they had been broken into different spheres of influence. In the post-Cold War environment, however, especially now with the Ukraine war happening, we're seeing a changing of fortunes as these countries are rediscovering each other. And we're already in an environment where a lot of them are consider themselves so familial that they already have a lot of joint embassies around the world. But if there's one thing they're all concerned about, it's Russia. Denmark is the last country approaching the Baltic Sea, so that if the Russians ever make a bid to get into the open ocean, they go by them. The Norwegians control the northern coastline, so they know the North Point is something they're responsible for. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania used to be Russian colonies under the Soviet period, and Sweden is a mid-sized power that was ultimately smashed by Russian power 3 centuries ago, and only recently has kind of emerged, whereas Finland was both a Swedish territory and a Russian territory based on which time frame you're looking at, and only really became independent in a traditional sense in the last decade or so as it's broken away from its Finlandization programs, which were basically a way that the Soviets used to crush Finns' strategic autonomy. What we're seeing now is this whole cluster of countries coming back together all on the same side of the same geopolitical orientation, no longer fractured by other powers, with Sweden absolutely being the center weight of all of it. It's probably best to think of most of these countries not so much as countries, but as cities that just happen to own another swath of territory. So in the case of, say, Riga or Copenhagen or Oslo, over half, in fact, almost 3/4 of the population is in that one city, and the rest of the territory just kind of hangs on. Sweden is the exception. I mean, yes, Stockholm is by far the largest, but it actually has a populated zone in the south that is agricultural. There are a number of cities going up and down the Baltic Sea coast. And so it is arguably as powerful, if not more powerful, than all of the others put together. And now that Sweden is emerging from its traditional neutrality and starting to write its own security policies, it is going to be a major force to be reckoned with. A couple things about this region to keep in mind. Number one, it is very, very naval. Because of the Baltic Sea, because of the Gulf of Bothnia, this is a zone that if they're going to survive, they have to do so in the context of having a powerful navy to keep potential rivals at bay. And that means, number two, it's actually fairly easy for them to partner with other powers from out of region, assuming for the moment that those other powers are also naval. Because if they were to partner with, say, the French or the Germans, who are primarily land powers, these countries would see themselves overwhelmed. They're just not big enough. Sweden doesn't even have 10 million people versus, say, France is roughly 60. The whole region put together can't add up to a France, much less a Germany. But if you bring in the United Kingdom, you've got a very different sort of power dynamic. The United Kingdom, like the Swedes, like the Danes, like the Estonians, really doesn't want to see a single large mega power emerge in the Eurasian or the European space, because that would be a threat to their naval independence. And so the Brits have always gotten along spectacularly with all of the Scandinavians, and now that the Swedes and the Finns are ditching neutrality, the partnership between London and these places is very strong. To a lesser degree, the United States is in the same place. Now, the United States overall is looking to slim down its security commitments moving forward, but it doesn't take a lot of cooperation between the Americans and, say, the Finns and the Swedes and the Norwegians in order to achieve some outside outcomes, because all of the Scandinavians just want to maintain independence, which means they're always going to be, to a degree, hostile to anything that happens in Moscow and, to a lesser degree, continental Europe. That means for a very small price, the United States can really achieve some outsized outcomes working through some very capable partners. So we should start to think of the relationship between the Americans and the Baltics and the Norwegians and the Scandinavians, however you want to define the cluster, as very similar to the American relationship with Australia. A powerful, creative ally that punches above its weight, that's going to do its own thing for its own reason, but which dovetails with American power moving forward. All right, that's it for me. Catch you guys next time.